You are 19 years old, lying on packed earth inside a hut, and it has been 14 hours. No doctor, no hospital, no medicine that will speed this up, dull the pain, or stop the bleeding if something goes wrong. Just two older women beside you who have done this before, and who somehow, without ever reading a single page about anatomy, know exactly when to tell you to push. This is how every one of your ancestors was born, for hundreds of thousands of years, with no epidurals, no ultrasounds, no sterile gloves. And here's the number that should stop you cold. For most of human history, roughly 1 in every 100 births ended with the mother dead. Women didn't give birth once. They gave birth 5, 6, 8 times in a lifetime. Run those odds that many times, and you start to wonder how our species made it at all. So that's what this video is actually about. How did ancient humans survive childbirth? Again and again, generation after generation, with zero medicine. Not luck. There was an actual system behind it. And the reason childbirth was so dangerous in the first place is the same reason our species became this dangerously smart to begin with. Here's the problem nobody designed. Somewhere around 2 million years ago, two things happened to the human body at almost the same time, and they were working against each other. First, we started walking upright full-time. A pelvis built for two-legged walking has to be narrow. A wide pelvis makes you slower, less efficient, worse at covering long distances, which mattered enormously for a species that survived by tracking and outlasting prey. Second, our brains started getting bigger, dramatically bigger. A newborn chimpanzee's brain is already close to 40% of its adult size at birth. A human newborn's brain is only about 25%, and it's still one of the largest heads, relative to the birth canal, of any primate on Earth. So you've got a skeleton evolving to be narrow, and a skull evolving to be enormous. And both of those pressures are happening on the same body, at the same time, for the same species. Anthropologists call this the obstetrical dilemma. It sounds abstract until you picture it literally. A head that barely fits through an opening that can't get any wider without ruining the ability to walk and run. No other animal on the planet has cut it this close. A giraffe calf drops 6 feet onto the ground and is standing in under an hour. A human baby can't lift its own head for weeks. Evolution's actual solution to this was not to make the pelvis wider or the head smaller. It was to kick the baby out early. Human infants are born at a developmental stage that, compared to other primates, is basically premature. Everything else a chimp does in the womb, human babies finish outside of it. That's why a newborn can't walk, can't regulate its own temperature, can't do much of anything except cry and eat. We traded a longer, safer pregnancy for a narrower window of survivability during birth. Every human birth is a compromise your ancestors made a couple million years ago, and you're the result of every one of those compromises going right. But that compromise created a second problem, one just as strange. Because of that narrow pelvis, the human baby doesn't just slide out head first the way most mammals do. It has to rotate. The head enters the pelvis facing sideways, then turns to face backward as it descends. Then the shoulders have to turn a different direction to clear the bones on the way out. It's less like a delivery and more like a three-dimensional puzzle solving itself in real time, inside a body, in the dark. And here's the part that changes everything about how we think about ancient birth. A mother physically cannot do that last part alone. Most primates give birth alone, reach down, and guide their own baby out face first, because the baby is coming out facing them. Human babies come out facing away from the mother, backward, which means if she reaches down to help, she risks bending the newborn's spine and neck the wrong way. Anthropologist Wenda Trevathan proposed something that's now widely supported, called the doula hypothesis. It argues that human childbirth was never meant to be a solo act. From deep in our evolutionary past, birth required a second set of hands. Not for comfort, for basic mechanics. That single fact rewrites the whole picture. It means that somewhere in the last few million years, alongside fire and tools and language, humans also had to evolve something you'd never think to put on the list. Cooperation at the exact moment of birth. Ancient birth was never a woman disappearing into a cave by herself. It was, from the very beginning, a team event. That team had a name in nearly every culture we have records of, and it had nothing to do with formal medicine. It was experience. In almost every society anthropologists have studied, births were attended by women who had already given birth themselves, usually older, usually related, usually women who had personally witnessed dozens of births by the time they were called on to help with one. This wasn't a job title. It was a role that accumulated automatically, the way expertise always does, through repetition and memory instead of textbooks. These attendants carried real functional knowledge, even without understanding the biology behind it. They knew how to read the position of a baby through touch, feeling the shape of the mother's belly to guess whether the baby was head down or breech. They knew certain positions, squatting, kneeling, hanging from a rope or a branch, used gravity to help labor progress, which is a big part of why upright birthing positions appear independently in cultures across every continent, long before anyone understood the physics of it. They knew that walking during early labor could help. They knew how to encourage a mother when contractions slowed, and when to simply wait, because impatience during labor has been killing mothers and babies since long before anyone wrote that down. They also had an early form of pain management, and it wasn't nothing. Across different regions, birth attendants used specific plants, willow bark for pain, raspberry leaf believed to strengthen contractions, and herbs to help expel the placenta. Some of these had real pharmacological effects. Willow bark contains a compound chemically related to aspirin. It wasn't guesswork stacked on guesswork. It was generations of trial and observation, refined the same slow way every piece of ancient survival knowledge was refined, by paying attention to what worked and quietly discarding what didn't. But knowledge could only carry a birth so far, and this is where the story gets darker, because it has to. The honest number is this. Best estimates for maternal mortality across most of human prehistory and into the ancient historical world sit somewhere around 1 to 1.5% per birth. That sounds almost survivable, until you remember that women in societies without reliable contraception weren't giving birth once. They were giving birth 5 times, 8 times, sometimes more across a lifetime. Run a 1% risk 5 to 8 separate times, and the lifetime odds stop looking small. Some estimates suggest that in parts of the ancient and medieval world, roughly 1 in 8 to 1 in 10 women eventually died from complications related to childbirth. It was, for most of history, one of the single greatest threats to a woman's life, greater in aggregate than warfare, greater than most disease. The two things that killed most often were the two things you'd expect once you understand the biology: hemorrhage, bleeding that wouldn't stop after delivery, and obstructed labor, when the baby simply could not pass, sometimes because of that same narrow pelvis evolution had never fully resolved. Without surgery, without blood transfusion, without antibiotics, both of these were often a death sentence, and everyone attending the birth knew it. This is the part modern audiences tend to skip past, but ancient people did not skip past it. They lived inside that risk every single time. And that fear is exactly why the knowledge around birth became so protected, so ritualized, and so carefully passed down. It wasn't superstition for its own sake. It was a survival system built by people who had watched things go wrong and were determined that the next generation would know a little more than they did. The proof that this wasn't guesswork is written down, literally, further back than most people expect. The Kahun gynecological papyrus from Egypt, dated to around 1800 BCE, is one of the oldest surviving medical documents in existence, and a large portion of it is devoted entirely to women's reproductive health, pregnancy, and birth complications. A few centuries later, the Ebers Papyrus expands on this, with remedies and instructions clearly built from accumulated clinical observation, not myth. This means Egyptian healers were systematically documenting birth-related medicine nearly 4,000 years ago, organizing knowledge the same way any field organizes itself, by writing down what a previous generation learned, so the next one wouldn't have to learn it from nothing. By the 2nd century CE, a physician named Soranus of Ephesus wrote what's essentially a full textbook on gynecology and midwifery, describing fetal positioning, breech presentation, and how a trained attendant should intervene when labor stalled. Some of what Soranus described, manually turning a poorly positioned baby, recognizing which presentations were dangerous, remained standard practice for over 1,000 years after he wrote it. Ancient medicine gets dismissed today as primitive, but the people delivering babies in the ancient world were running an early, working version of clinical obstetrics, built entirely on observation, centuries before anyone understood a single hormone or nerve involved in the process. If you're finding this as fascinating as we do, take a second to subscribe, because the part of this story that surprises people the most is still ahead, and it has nothing to do with medicine at all. It has to do with grandmothers. Because here's a question almost nobody asks. Why do human females live for decades after they stop being able to have children? Almost no other species does this. A chimpanzee, an elephant, nearly every mammal remains fertile until close to the end of its life. Menopause, followed by decades of continued life, is close to unique to humans. And evolution does not typically keep a trait around unless it's paying for itself somehow. Researcher Kristen Hawkes studied the Hadza, a hunter-gatherer community in Tanzania, and found a striking pattern. Grandmothers who were no longer having children of their own were consistently among the most productive food gatherers in the group, and their labor freed up mothers to nurse, recover from birth, and care for newborns. This became known as the grandmother hypothesis, and it reframes something people assume is a modern convenience. Extended, dedicated childcare from women with direct birth experience wasn't invented by hospitals or parenting books. It's possibly one of the oldest support systems our species ever built, quite literally written into why human women live as long as they do after their fertile years end. That support extended past birth itself and into the weeks after, because the danger didn't end when the baby arrived. Postpartum hemorrhage could kill hours or days later. Infection, with no understanding of germs, could turn a healthy new mother sick within a week. This is why nearly every culture we have records of built specific postpartum rituals, defined recovery periods, restricted activity, particular foods believed to rebuild strength and blood. Modern medicine would eventually explain some of this through iron levels and immune recovery. But long before anyone had that language, people had already noticed that a woman who rested and was fed and cared for in the weeks after birth was more likely to survive than one who wasn't, and they built entire customs around protecting that window. None of this means ancient childbirth was safe. It wasn't. It means something more interesting. It means our ancestors were running a genuinely sophisticated system of risk management, built entirely from observation, memory, cooperation, and plants, centuries before anyone could explain why any single piece of it worked. Every squat instead of lying flat, every hand pressed against a laboring back, every herb passed down from one healer to the next, every grandmother staying behind to gather food so a new mother could rest. These were not primitive guesses. They were a working technology, just one made of people and knowledge instead of steel and machines. And it's worth sitting with what that number really means. If maternal mortality was somewhere around 1 to 1.5% per birth for most of human history, then think about how many births had to go right, one after another, unbroken, for thousands of generations, for you to exist at all. Not one lucky birth. An entire chain of them, stretching back further than any written record, every single link surviving something that, by the numbers, did not always end well for everyone who tried. The instruments changed eventually. Forceps appeared in the 1600s, kept as a closely guarded family secret by the Chamberlain family in England for nearly 100 years before the design became known. Caesarean sections, long survivable only for the child and almost never the mother in ancient accounts, didn't become a procedure a woman could reliably survive until antiseptic technique and anesthesia arrived in the 19th century. Blood transfusion, the single biggest answer to hemorrhage, the oldest and most consistent killer in childbirth, didn't become safe and reliable until the 20th century, after blood typing was discovered. In the long span of human history, real medical intervention for birth is a genuinely recent arrival. Almost everything before that point, everything that got us here, was people, watching, remembering, teaching, and showing up for each other in a room with no machines and no certainty, over and over, for 200,000 years. That's the real answer to how ancient humans survived childbirth without medicine. Not that it was easier than we think. It was harder and more dangerous and more frequently fatal than almost anything else people faced day to day. They survived it the same way they survived the cave lion and the winter and the hungry season, not with a single invention, but by refusing to let anyone go through it alone, and by making sure that whatever one generation learned, the next one didn't have to learn from nothing. Every hand on a laboring back was data. Every grandmother who stayed was infrastructure. Every plant that worked got remembered, and everyone that didn't got quietly left behind. Somewhere in that room, right now, is the oldest form of medicine we have. Not a pill, not a machine, just someone else, staying.